Planet Zoo's release was highly anticipated, for it was a chance to revive the nostalgic sentiment of the golden age of zoo simulation games from the early 2000s. Applying their experience of park management titles over the years, Frontier Developments have delivered a zoo game fit for the modern era, combining realistic animals and limitless creative tools in a light-hearted, whimsical atmosphere with a delicate touch of awareness for conservation. In this review, we will comprehensively analyze the game, its post-release development, and DLC releases over the past year, assessing its merits, critiquing its flaws, and evaluating its price tag. We'll also make several comparisons to the zoo games of old, and assess how well Planet Zoo has reinvented the classic zoo genre. This is Planet Zoo, a year in review. The early 2000s saw the emergence of a string of popular zoo management sims that defined this period as the golden age of zoo games. Zoo Tycoon in 2001 introduced the iconic formula that would recur onto sequels and across the genre. Players build and expand a zoo by purchasing animals, constructing suitable habitats, and caring for their welfare. At the same time, theme park management mechanics inspired by Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 years prior were also introduced. Players had to also manage guest happiness and finances by constructing amenities and providing attractions. Zoo Tycoon also saw the popularization of the expansion pack model, which became a critical component of this genre, allowing the developers to bolster the roster of the animals and add new mechanics to continue support of their games post-release. The subsequent few years saw many studios adopt this formula into games such as Wildlife Park, Jurassic Park Operation Genesis, and Zoo Empire. But it was the sequel, Zoo Tycoon 2, which proved immensely popular with its 3D innovation, intimate perspective, and continued support with expansion packs and modability. Its legacy stretches to this day, as Zoo Tycoon 2 is regarded as one of the most influential zoo games of all time. Meanwhile, Frontier Developments had plied their trade in the simulation genre with efforts in the Roller Coaster Tycoon and Thrillville series. The next decade saw Frontier take the reins on the anticipated series revival of Zoo Tycoon in 2013. However, this game was an Xbox exclusive until 2017 and was generally poorly received with its limited mechanics and simplistic gameplay. This was the last notable zoo game before Planet Zoo and failed to satiate the desire for a true Zoo Tycoon successor. Frontier's next major management sim was Planet Coaster, released in 2016, arguably the title that brought them mainstream recognition, honing in a decade's worth of simulation game experience to deliver a massively praised spiritual sequel to the Roller Coaster Tycoon series. Jurassic World Evolution in 2018 was next, highlighting the studio's Cobra engine advancements in environmental decals, animal models, and rigging animations work. Jurassic World Evolution also revived the dinosaur management sim subgenre and was seen as a spiritual successor to Jurassic Park Operation Genesis. We have done a similar review for Jurassic World Evolution, which you can check out here. Frontier's pedigree in management sims has no doubt established themselves as the perfect candidate studio to revive this concept, with the community hoping to see a zoo game built for the PC with the limitless creativity of Planet Coaster. Planet Zoo was subsequently announced in April and released in November of 2019. The game received generally positive reviews from the outset, and over the past year has seen 3 DLCs and major content patches released to further support the game. This review will cover the base Planet Zoo game coupled with its deluxe edition and the 3 DLC packs, the Arctic, South America, and Australia pack. Planet Zoo continues Planet Coaster's whimsical and colourful vibe that presents to players a family-friendly attitude, but also embraces the appropriate realism when it concerns the animals directly. Like Planet Coaster, Planet Zoo is built on a similar graphics engine and user interface, with its typically crisp textures, details, and realistic lighting, but there are also several marked improvements. The addition of grass textures allows the player to produce lush terrain floors, and for a zoo game, this was very much required. The addition of weather effects was also welcome, such as rain and snow. With different maps based on worldwide locations, building zoos in different biomes will produce different lighting filters and weather events. A zoo in Mexico will exude a definitive desert atmosphere, whilst an Arctic zoo will appropriately feel cold. Most objects, including the animals, are portrayed quite realistically and in great detail, but visitors and staff, pretty much all the human models, are composed in typical low poly and cartoonish flavor, mostly because they aren't the focus of the game. It helps to reduce the performance demands and adds to the light-hearted atmosphere. The bubbly user interface is also essentially unchanged from Planet Coaster, with simple additions to accommodate new mechanics and the animal interaction tabs. Overall, Planet Zoo resembles Planet Coaster in almost all graphical and thematic aspects, with small improvements to make the engine relevant to a zoo simulation theme. However, this direction makes the game quite approachable, especially to children, and provides an accessible platform for players moving from Planet Coaster. Music is an absolute strong point for Planet Zoo, and the studio has recalled Jim Guthrie and J.J. Ibsen to replicate the folk-inspired blissful soundtrack of Planet Coaster, not only providing a relaxing backdrop whilst playing or building your zoo, but animal sounds, nature ambience, and safari motifs are implemented to contribute a wild and animalistic impression on the music, helping to inspire the player's creativity and contributes to the family-friendly tone. Many of the music tracks are played in the background of this video to give viewers a sense of that atmosphere. Performance has been a persistent problem with Planet Coaster, and those issues still pertain with Planet Zoo. With relatively low quality settings, most computers will be able to run this game, and the PC entry point is actually quite low, with not too demanding minimum requirements. But if you have ambitions to build super detailed parks with extensive constructions and hundreds of animals, the game will slow down to a crawl even on the most powerful gaming setups. The main causes seem to be high visitor counts and objects with high piece counts. The game will suffer frame rate drops once a high amount of visitors enter your zoo, resulting in intensive CPU usage due to all the paving and traffic calculations, but this can be controlled with the guest limit setting. The game will also be laggy if you load in maps with a huge amount of foliage, detailed objects, and buildings made up of hundreds or thousands of pieces. Obviously, you can limit the object count by making simpler designs, but this will come at the cost of creativity and delays the lag rather than solving the issue. Unfortunately, if you want to construct a highly detailed, expansive, and realistic zoo whilst maintaining high frame rates and high settings, you're going to need to fork out on a powerful computer. Planet Zoo is also pretty unstable. The game constantly crashes even to this day after many performance updates. It's still rife with annoying bugs, and there's some strange occurrences with the audio, such as popping and looping sounds. It's much better stability-wise than at launch, however. Planet Zoo is a lot more robust when it comes to the animals, however. This game contains some of the best made animal models and animations of any game out there. But the roster of animals available is arguably the subject of most scrutiny. In Planet Zoo, the animal roster is divided into two types: habitat animals, which require the construction of custom enclosures. These are generally larger animals such as mammals, ground birds, and large reptiles, attracting the majority of the player attention. The other animal type are the exhibit animals, which are placed inside ploppable glass terrariums. A variety of smaller reptiles, amphibians, insects, arthropods, and gastropods can be placed in here. The current roster sits at 90 animals, inclusive of both habitat and exhibit animals from all the DLCs. The base roster and deluxe edition includes a pleasing variety of iconic zoo animals, but also many lesser known species to boost diversity, and it's commendable Frontier developments have focused a lot of effort to expose many endangered species. Unsurprisingly, there is a huge focus on African animals, corresponding to their increased representation in real-life zoos, with around 30 or so animal species from this continent, whilst the continents of Europe, South America and Australia were almost entirely ignored. We've done a separate review of the release roster you can watch for more information. Since release, however, 3 DLC packs have somewhat addressed this issue, themed around the Arctic, South American and Australian continents. Therefore, the current roster of Planet Zoo today has decent worldwide representation, enough to appease a global fanbase, but the decision to exclude many continents initially to force players to shell out on DLC is ultimately an aggravating business model. However, to this day, there are still excluded varieties of iconic zoo animals, such as leopards, meerkats, African rhinos, or deer species. All should have been included from the outset. For players that were perhaps hopeful for a more ambitious zoo game, there are no aquatic animals or aviary birds, despite being quintessential parts of modern zoological institutes. As a result, there are no seals or penguins, no birds or bats, for instance. For a modernized successor to zoo games of the last decade, some of which covered these concepts, such as Zoo Tycoon Marine Mania, it has become an expectation of this game, and subsequently the lack thereof is disappointing. The animals that are in the game, however, are rendered quite beautifully, and this has been a recurring theme across Frontier's games involving animals. Although anatomical accuracy isn't entirely perfect across the board, the ability of the highly detailed models to perform a wide range of animations makes Planet Zoo the most realistic animal simulator currently on the market. Each animal species has its own distinct model, articulately crafted down to the skin layer. For instance, animals with fur actually have a fuzzy outer layer. Crocodiles have their typical scaly skin, whilst elephants have a leathery, hairless surface. What's more, these skin surfaces interact with the environment, getting wet when the animal goes into the water, for instance. Patch 1.3, released in August, differentiated coloring schemes for every individual of a species. This allows players to further identify single individuals in an enclosure, perhaps to inspire unique nicknames. This feature should have really been in the release version of the game, however. Animations are a particular highlight, although not every species is unique in the animation set, as Frontier has clearly made several base rigs and attached different species skins on top of them. It's enough to not be noticeable to the average player. The standard sleeping, feeding, drinking and socialization animations are all there, but there are countless more idle animations when the animals are simply playing or enjoying their free time in their enclosures. This includes when they interact with enrichment objects, or distinct walking versus running animations, swimming animations, and a separate subset of animations just for infant animals. The animal sounds and noises are also quite satisfactory. Although, again, we can have some minor bones to pick for realism's sake, the experience is nevertheless decent for the average player, with a variety of distinct, iconic sounds. Some soft, some loud, some absolutely irritating, and some seriously cute. These facets together make a strong case for Planet Zoo having the most realistic animals in any zoo game. Just watching the animals idle by and living out their lives in their setting seems like something out of a nature documentary. Planet Zoo makes immense strides from the classic zoo games of old, especially in terms of advancing the gameplay experience, but the developers have seemingly pushed the direction of the game as a creativity-focused zoo builder first and a zoo simulator second. There's a clear focus on construction play rather than management play, and most of the hours played in Planet Zoo is done while the game is paused. Regardless, we'll cover these management mechanics in this section of the video. Planet Zoo has 4 game modes of play. Career mode, challenge, and sandbox are essentially the same as adapted from Planet Coaster, all playable offline, whilst Planet Zoo introduces a new online-only franchise mode. Most gameplay mechanics are, however, virtually the same over all the game modes, the key differences being the starting conditions. Career mode is essentially the story or campaign mode of Planet Zoo, and a mode we'll discuss separately later in the video. Challenge mode and sandbox mode are pretty much self-explanatory, as they echo the same premise from the Zoo Tycoon series, with players starting on an empty plot of land to build the zoo of their dreams. Challenge mode imposes starting conditions and issues periodic missions to complete for cash, while sandbox is limitless and unrestricted for maximum creativity and freedom. Franchise mode, on the other hand, is a sort of reward progression-based style game mode that encourages players to nurture a franchise of zoos, starting their brand from small, humble beginnings before managing a network of parks around the world. Animals are purchased entirely from an online marketplace where other players can sell their own specimens from their own franchise, with prices fluctuating on a simple supply-demand model. The focus of this mode is on conservation credits, obtained by performing various conservation-focused tasks, acting as the global currency used to purchase rarer, higher-tier animals with better genetic traits. It is also used to open up more zoos and expand your franchise. This mode features a relatively interesting premise, as it's the first game mode in any zoo game media where players can manage a brand of zoos around the world rather than just playing a single save. When starting your own personal zoo in one of the 3 challenge, sandbox, or franchise modes, the player is given the freedom to select their own biome and continent from a detailed 3D globe, similar to Zoo Tycoon 2. However, the choice here is actually meaningful, as depending on which location you choose, can have drastic differences in terrain ruggedness, weather, and temperature. Important considerations for difficulty. If you're planning to breed some polar bears, perhaps it's best not to build a zoo under the scorching sun of the Saharan desert, lest you have to spend money on maintaining coolers to bring temperatures down. Map selection also affects the terrain paintbrushes as well. For instance, many grassland maps have a yellowish savanna grass as their dense grass brush, so if you want a greener, more fertile grass, you'll have to go with a temperate or rainforest map. Players can also select a map from the career scenarios as well. These have several pre-built enclosures and amenities for a quick head start, perfect for newer players getting into the game. Planet Zoo's map sizes are also huge, so players should not be concerned at all about potential building space. They are comparable to those from Planet Coaster, and these maps are extremely generous and impossible to fill to the brim. Your PC will most likely explode before you're able to fill the entirety of the map up. Planet Zoo features a detailed Zoopedia, a portmanteau of zoo and encyclopedia. Featuring relevant game information for the entire animal roster, it is especially useful for players when considering which animals they want to adopt. Similar to Zoo Tycoon's own Zoopedia, this trove of information details all the animal species biomes, habitat sizes, temperature preferences, fence requirements, and preferred populations. It's the sort of accessibility that makes sure players know exactly what needs to be done to care for the animals, cutting out all the guesswork shenanigans when building habitats. Furthermore, it also contains various real-world information, such as a brief description of the animal's ecology, behavior, and conservation status, giving some flavor and education value. Zoo Tycoon's own Zoopedia was praised for this exact reason, helping to expose endangered or obscure animals to a wider audience. Obtaining animals in this game revolves around the animal market, where a limited amount of specimens from each species are periodically refreshed. Whereas in other games, simply having enough money is required to plop down animals, players have to go through a process of consideration when purchasing animals, especially since each individual from a species has variable genetic traits and coloration, affecting their overall rating. Not only does this add some market volatility and randomness to the game, as sometimes your ideal animal is not available, forcing you to wait or reconsider another species. It also helps players to generate a bond with their animal as they go through an extended process of thorough examination before their eventual adoption. I do wish, however, there was a bit more meat to this process in terms of sourcing the animals. In Planet Zoo, the animal listing is accompanied by a source of where the animal came from, such as a rescue animal or from a private collection or as a pet. An expansion of this mechanic could involve issuing expeditions to the wild to source a genetically pure specimen, or being paid to accommodate a rescued animal, helping to generate a backstory for each individual. In franchise mode, the animal market is restocked by animals sold from other players from their franchises, with Frontier also contributing some base specimens to keep the market from being completely empty. You can contribute your own specimens by selling animals that have been bred in your own zoos, netting some conservation credits. This mimics the sort of international trading that real-world zoological institutions partake in. This also means that there is a huge spectrum of quality, as there will be cheaper but lower rated specimens, as well as high tier world-class specimens available in stock, more variation than you would otherwise find in the other offline modes. If you're lucky and have the conservation credits, you can pick up some genetically superior, extremely high rated individuals that other players have selectively bred, even albino versions of some species, without having to go through the tedious process of breeding them yourself. The overall welfare of an animal is determined by their nutrition, social, habitat, and enrichment requirements, and managing this is the core gameplay loop involving caring for your animals. The obvious aim is to have this as high as possible, as guests and annual inspectors will judge your zoo on this metric, keep the animals happy to avoid fines, and continue rolling in those donations. Nutrition is the easiest to manage, as simply having some sort of food-related object, water source, and zookeeper access to the respective enclosure is enough. There are many ways to feed animals in this game, with some species having multiple methods of feeding. Players can provide simple trays or research more elaborate enrichment objects. Increasing the food quality through research will also provide an extra welfare bonus. Similarly, animals can drink the natural water inside their habitat or from a water carrying object. Natural water, however, must be cleaned with a water treatment plant. Some animals prefer to be alone, others need a large herd, and this is summarized in their social welfare. Maintaining a target population is pretty simple until your animals start breeding, and for some solitary species such as tigers or bears, it may be advised to create new habitats to accommodate the new generation or sell off the adults. Habitat requirements are arguably the most complicated, as different species have different size, terrain, shelter, water, foliage, and temperature preferences that must be accounted for during habitat construction. This makes designing and tweaking habitats the most time-consuming aspect of managing animals. The concept is nothing too different from other zoo games, but we'll talk more about how powerful the tools are to create detailed, expansive habitats for your animals later on in the creativity section. An extra focus is placed on enriching the animals' lives whilst they're in captivity. As modern zoos have progressed in the field of making sure the animals are not only taken care of, but also enjoying life, Planet Zoo encourages the placement of enrichment objects to provide stimulation. Unlocked through research, there are lots and loads of different items to experiment with, and since animals can get bored of the same toys, they also need to be cycled periodically. This encourages players to check up on their animals once in a while and promotes more dynamic gameplay. It won't be a management game without revolving around money. There are many costs associated with running a zoo, but virtually all sources of income come from guests. Ticket prices will drive early income, but like real-life zoos, donations will end up becoming the main benefactor. A small trickle of revenue will also come from what guests spend inside your zoo, such as food, drinks, and gifts. Planet Zoo, however, suffers from the similar financial difficulty curves as Frontier's previous titles in Jurassic World Evolution and Planet Coaster, in that finances are difficult initially when you're building up your zoo, but by the mid-game, with enough animals to keep guests churning through the turnstiles, finances become essentially irrelevant, as there's really not enough expensive things to purchase. Most of the rare and expensive animals in the late game are purchased via conservation credits, so it seems the financial management aspect was not designed with longevity in mind, and this significantly lowers the overall difficulty of the game. After the animals, guests are the next most important to keep happy, as they drive your zoo's economy. Guests begin spawning as soon as the first animal is released into a habitat or exhibit, and their willingness to enter your zoo will depend on your overall zoo rating, taking into account ticket prices, marketing, and animal ratings. Also, it's advised to turn on guest limits because this is one of the major factors of late game lag. Inside the zoo, guests will wander randomly throughout, prioritizing seeing animals, but will seek out amenities if any of their needs starts dwindling. Keeping these needs satisfied and allowing your guests to gaze upon happy animals results in stable guest happiness. Staff are essential to running errands around your zoo. There are 6 types of staff. Caretakers are the janitors from Planet Coaster and do many of the benign tasks such as trash disposal and toilet cleaning. Keepers are in charge of feeding the animals and keeping habitats and exhibits clean. The veterinarian is in charge of the health of the animals, but also does disease and enrichment research. The mechanic maintains and fixes fences and utilities, but also does some research to unlock new construction assets and building themes. Finally, the vendors and security guards are ported from Planet Coaster. Vendors work in shops and serve customers, whilst security guards prevent theft and vandalism from occurring, as well as making sure all zoo rules are being followed. Staff must be kept happy or else they will quit. They are hired initially at trainee level, where they don't mind being underpaid. As your zoo gets larger and increased efficiency is required, you can train your staff, though they will be a lot more strict about their wages. It is thus a balancing act to make sure your staff are paid enough to be happy whilst not too highly as to affect your bottom line, but also to make sure they are not overworked and occasionally upgraded to perform their jobs efficiently. Staff must also be optimized with their routing as they must travel to and from locations. For instance, keepers need to walk between habitats and exhibits to tend to the animals, but they also need to travel to keeper huts to prepare food. Staff also have energy levels. They must periodically rest at staff rooms, so the locations of these facilities dictates how far your staff need to travel and subsequently how effectively they can do their jobs. Luckily, there are several mechanics to assist the player, such as dedicated staff-only paths and the ability to set work zones. As we can see, there is a recurring theme where Planet Zoo promotes good construction habits as a way to optimize gameplay rather than direct optimization through more conventional management mechanics. This idea ties in further with other facilities and utilities. Planet Zoo has a power mechanic, so all facilities and powered objects such as lights require electricity. Researching in the workshop unlocks more power generation methods such as renewable energy. The other utility is water treatment plants, which clean bodies of water in your zoo and are needed if you plan on having animals drink their natural habitat water or just keeping waterways crystal clear. All utilities, as well as barriers that form the walls and fences of habitats, require periodic maintenance from mechanics. Destroyed barriers will entice animals to escape, triggering guests to panic. There isn't really any negative, however, besides being an annoyance, as you can simply click a button to box the animal yourself or wait for one of the staff members to capture it. Guests also require various facilities to satisfy their needs. Strategic placement of food, drinks, and toilets are necessary to provide convenience, but vendors are needed to serve customers and caretakers needed to clean toilets, adding more importance to location. Vending machines were added in patch 1.3 to somewhat alleviate this issue, providing a cheaper, less satisfying but staff-free alternative to vendor-operated stalls. Each facility has further customization options. For instance, the staff room can slot a perk, which gives a buff to all staff using this facility, or you can adjust condiments served in food and drink shops to provide slight bonuses to guest satisfaction levels. It's not quite the level of depth seen from Planet Coaster, however, as deeper customizability is probably more appropriate for a theme park setting. Planet Zoo's research system requires a research center to be constructed and a veterinarian to perform the research. It plays out differently from previous zoo games, which usually entails unlocking more animals, buildings, and items as the game progresses. In Planet Zoo, all the animals are available from the start. Once you introduce that animal to your zoo, you can begin researching the particular species to unlock more tools to manage that specific species' welfare, such as higher quality food and enrichment items. Veterinarians can also research vaccines to treat an array of diseases that can affect your animals. The mechanic performs a subset of research in a workshop, unlocking new shop types, building themes, advanced power utilities, and animal barriers. Although I do like the game's deeper research system, it's quite complicated to set up as there are a lot more hoops to jump through to do research. Finally, Planet Zoo adds an emphasis on educating guests and indirectly the player about the issues facing animals today. For starters, education is an actual mechanic, a rating on how well information is displayed to guests. Animal signs, speakers, and conservation billboards all contribute to the rating, adding an element of realism as modern upstanding zoos focus quite heavily on this aspect. I would have liked to see slightly more expansion in this area, however, especially in regards to zookeepers, who in modern zoos play an active role in educating the guests, adapting their real-world roles better as not only animal caretakers but educators on conservationism would have generated some gameplay immersion as well as highlighting a growingly urgent issue. Planet Zoo brings relatively fresh ideas to an otherwise overused zoo game formula, which has been recycling mechanics for more than a decade. However, the emphasis on trying to perfect a zoo layout is exemplified by the dependency to have buildings and facilities in the right places, which is perfectly fine, though I feel that it results in the majority of my playing time being in pause mode, building and tweaking rather than running a zoo in play mode. And if you're a person who actually prefers to play the game, interact with the animals and manage the administrative aspects, or have little inclination to maximize usage of the building tools, this should really question how much value you will get out of the game. The lack of an addictive gameplay loop is probably the reasoning behind the gameplay staleness, and a feature that is sorely lacking is a first-person mode. In Zoo Tycoon 2, even in Frontier's remake of the series in 2013, the ability to become a zookeeper, walk around your zoo, and interact with the animals was a major highlight that made playing the game outside of pause mode enjoyable, because you can actually experience your construction achievements from a personal perspective. This wasn't an expected feature before the game's release, but I feel like the players such as myself who've enjoyed through the classic zoo games see this as an iconic feature of the zoo game genre. In the end, it's not quite the simulation running wild or meaningful management that was marketed by the developers. Planet Zoo's mechanics, although decent and interesting, tend to take a back seat to more of a zoo architect style gameplay experience. Where Planet Zoo shines most can be summarized with its other marketing motto, limitless creativity, reinforcing the idea that Planet Zoo should be idealized as a zoo designer or zoo architect game. There are many tools available for players to craft and mold the zoo of their dreams, most particularly its advancement from a grid-based building system seen in the Alta Zoo titles. Most players coming from Planet Coaster will immediately recognize the powerful terrain tools that allow universal sculpting of the map, from creating mountains to making rivers and lakes. It's one of the greatest strengths of the game's Cobra engine, and dare I say one of the best terrain modifying tools in any simulation game ever. Not much needs to be said besides the fact that this is one of the main selling points of the game. Slightly more controversial is their paving system. Planet Zoo uses a snap-on paving system which is quite finicky and cumbersome, especially in how it interacts with the surrounding terrain, objects and buildings. I was quite surprised they didn't overhaul this system, given there was enough criticism in Planet Coaster to warrant a rework. There is an alternative grid-based paving mode which works slightly better, but to make curved paths I feel a point-to-point system would have been cleaner. Since so much planning of your zoo's layout is dependent on paving, this is the weakest link to what otherwise could have been a flawless build engine. Planet Zoo features an insane amount of natural items consisting of plants and rocks, great for beautifying an animal enclosure but also for spicing up general scenery around your park. Plants and rocks from all corners of the globe allow any biome or continental theme to be portrayed realistically with enough variety to create distinct sections of your zoo. Think a separate desert themed area in one place and a more tropical jungle themed area in another. All that is possible due to the sheer amount of diverse nature items. Habitat construction is an extremely pleasing affair, and Planet Zoo is the definitive game to make extremely detailed, realistic habitats that the animals will actually interact with. Habitats must be enclosed by the barrier system to denote the areas the animals can roam in. There are different types of materials with options to change heights, add glass windows, or climb-proof barriers. With the addition of invisible fences, you can also make natural barriers such as moats, rock walls, or steep terrain to encircle a habitat. If you're afraid of your animals having possible escape routes, there's a nifty UI filter that shows if your selected species can traverse over certain terrain elements in your habitat. Like in other zoo games, all animals have certain terrain preferences such as sand, rock, grass, and dirt, but instead of requiring strict and precise amounts of each, most animals have a preference range, adding a degree of flexibility. For instance, although lions are a savanna animal and prefer to have lots of grass in their enclosure, you can get away with making a full sandy or rocky desert habitat for them. They incur a slight welfare penalty, but nothing too major. This point continues for foliage as well. Animals will have preferences for certain plants from the same biome and continent, as well as preferences for how much tree cover they want. But the player can completely override this and choose their own selection of flora, again incurring a very slight welfare penalty. This allows players who wish to be more creative put their stamp on their own habitat designs instead of following a realism template. Animals will have their own set of interactions with their related enrichment items, unlocked through research, but animals will also interact with the environment around them and anything the players put inside, such as climbing trees or swimming in their habitat pool. You can even build dedicated climbing frames for animals such as primates. Players can even combine the terrain and the objects for some seriously imaginative ideas. For instance, you can shape a spiral ramp up to a feeding platform or an enrichment item, or carve out a small cave and have a sleeping den in there. You add some habitat bedding and encourage the animals to sleep in this cave, or create a giant wooden bridge across a water moat where elephants can walk across. Exhibit animals, since they are limited to the terrarium feature, are obviously more restrictive in terms of creativity. Inside the terrarium, the biome is preset to the animal's biological distribution. Through research, you can add more objects such as rocks and trees, heat lamps, or mist machines. And that's about it inside the exhibit. But outside, players can still decorate the exhibit as if it was an object. And that's where the vast quantity of construction pieces come in. Planet Zoo today, with all of its DLCs, has close to 2,500 pieces, from walls and roofs to windows and columns. Not only structural objects, but decorative ones too, such as motifs, statues, and scenery. Planet Zoo also utilizes a powerful lighting and effects engine, so creating scenes like waterfalls or nighttime ambience is easy. Combined with the XYZ builder engine adapted from Planet Coaster, where players can translate and rotate along all axes with 360 degrees of motion, Planet Zoo has the ingredients available for players to quite literally build anything they want to build. If constructing painstakingly detailed buildings are not exactly your thing, and I'd assume that's probably the majority of the target audience, then there's also blueprints you can simply plop down onto the terrain. Blueprints are prefabricated buildings with designs themed around certain architectural or continental styles, such as the modern theme or the African and East Asian theme. The DLC packs also feature some extra blueprints using the new objects and themed around their respective continents. Planet Zoo also has Steam Workshop integration, allowing players to share their own blueprints, and you can find almost any building or object you're after without needing to put in the time and artistic effort. With base game and workshop blueprints, most casual players will be able to get by with a standard plop and play type zoo design that's common with the classic zoo games, but may be encouraged to delve a little deeper into their more creative side with the opportunities provided with the building tools. Overall, Planet Zoo is honestly an artist's wet dream. If you are a creative-oriented player who likes to spend time making the details matter and is after the end result, this game truly unleashes that potential with its powerful terrain and building tools, coupled with the staggering quantity of foliage, rocks, and building objects. It's a testament that players are even using this engine not just to build a zoo, but to show off their own architectural skills and live out their project fantasies. In respect to a zoo game though, this is by far the most freeform, artistic functionality ever given to the fingertips of players to build the zoological park of their dreams. Regardless, there are some issues, not just the fact that this shoehorns the gameplay experience more and more into the realm of design and architecture rather than strategy and management. This is the sort of game that asks the player to be in a certain type of mentality. If players feel a sense of artist block or a lack of artistic inspiration, it can really feel like this game becomes a chore. Because so much onus is placed on creation and design, casual players or those after a more grounded zoo management experience may feel a lack of value with this title if they can't identify with the creative processes of the game. They may also be annoyed by some of the more glaring issues with the build engine, especially the paving system, which is no way user-friendly or intuitive. Nevertheless, the creativity on offer is unrivaled compared to any other zoo game and should be praised as a defining high point. It just won't appeal to every single player. For the achievement-focused players, there is also a meaty career mode with 12 scenarios to test your skills on. The career mode also serves as a useful tutorial for new players, the first few scenarios doing just that, hand-holding through the basics of building and operating a zoo, whilst later scenarios guide through more advanced techniques. There is a star reward system, handing out bronze, silver or gold stars depending on how many objectives you achieve in each scenario, so there's some incentive for the completionist players. Appropriating the light-hearted mood of the game, the fully voiced, roughly 30-hour campaign follows the eccentric Bernie Goodwin as he tries to revitalize failing rundown zoos around the world. Further on, you'll work with more problematic characters, such as the business mogul Dominic Myers, who is also trying to grab a piece of the capitalist pie by investing in zoos. And from here, you'll try to pursue questionable zoo projects such as an abandoned casino turned zoo in India.
Apparently building a casino so it looks like a temple's in poor taste. Who knew?
To a disused radioactive mine in South America.
There's a teeny tiny chance that there are massive amounts of toxic waste here.
All the way to a Soviet-Russian zoo suffering from bureaucracy and on the verge of financial collapse.
It definitely has potential. Not much actual, but lots of potential.
The Arctic Pack continues the career story with 2 more missions, but unfortunately, none of the other packs add any more career scenarios, essentially finishing the storyline. Patch 1.3 update added a new time scenario mode with an initial free map based on the Estonian wetlands. Here the challenge is to build a thriving zoo and complete several objectives within a time limit, rewarding the player with stars corresponding to how well they performed. The Australia pack provides access to a time scenario based in Outback Australia, so there's only 2 time scenarios total right now, but I expect more will be added with later DLC packs. Overall, I quite enjoyed playing the career scenario. Although the story is nothing too special, I liked journeying around the world to exotic locations, even questionable places to build a zoo from scratch or take over existing poorly run ones. The pre-built zoos are also great for inspiration as they contain some really cool architectural blueprints you can implement in your own sandbox projects. As with any game in this modern age of gaming, it's worth to consider the developer's performance post-release, and that's part of the core methodology behind the Year in Review series. In a year, there have only been 3 major updates for Planet Zoo. Honestly, quite a mediocre amount of free content, but it's probable that COVID-19 had some effect. Patch 1.1 added slower animal aging, improved social and pack behaviors. Patch 1.2 reworked interface and quality of life issues, with finally patch 1.3 introducing animal color variations and vending machines. Arguably, all of these additions should have been in the base game to begin with, so the quality of content is kind of disappointing. All these updates coincided with the release of 3 DLC packs. The Arctic pack, launched a month after release, introduces the polar bear, reindeer, Arctic wolf and dhole sheep, as well as 2 campaign scenarios and over 200 new scenery pieces. The South American pack, launched in April of 2020, introduces 4 habitat animals in the jaguar, llama, capuchin monkey and giant anteater, with 1 exhibit animal in the red-eyed tree frog. It also came with over 250 new scenery pieces, but surprisingly no scenarios. Finally, the Australia pack, launched in August of 2020, welcomes the koala, the dingo, red kangaroo, southern cassowary as habitat animals, and the eastern blue-tongued lizard as an exhibit animal, combined with a further 230 scenery pieces. Australia pack also came with the addition of 1 time scenario, as we discussed before. We can see that there is a clear pattern of around 4 months between each DLC, with each pack providing 4 habitat animals and 1 exhibit animal for a total of 5 animals. This is expected to continue for the foreseeable future. However, I haven't been impressed at all with the DLC model for Planet Zoo for several reasons. This is a zoo game first and foremost. The game has gotten stale because the only content that feels fresh and worthwhile are new animals. Naturally, 5 new animals every 4 months is an extremely slow rate. I would have happily paid more for fleshed out expansion packs that provide more content, compared to say Zoo Tycoon series, which saw expansion packs numbering 20 or so animals at a time. Furthermore, many of the packs fail to fully represent the biodiversity from their respective continents. The South American pack excluded the capybara, for instance, one of the most exhibited animals in captivity today. The Australia pack excluded the Tasmanian devil, the echidna, the platypus, and other unique endemics. It feels like the packs are being propped up by the over 200 scenery items it comes with, but most players will hardly ever touch any of these. Subsequently, there is a huge question of value around the DLCs. All of them go for $10 US, with not enough animals being offered, and the popularity of the offerings questionable. Frontier developments are also seemingly against content generosity, like providing free animals for all players. Giving away free species every once in a while enhances the value of the game and relationship with the concurrent players, whilst helping to fill out the content excluded from the base roster or subsequent DLC packs. Again, the Zoo Tycoon series released free species occasionally from bonus downloads. Finally, the most disappointing point for me during this post-release period was the lack of a marine pack or aviary pack. These are the 2 concepts most players, including myself, absolutely want for the game, since the game was announced really, hoping for a marine or aquatic animals and flying birds, as they are relevant to real-world zoo rosters. There is, however, encouraging news on this front, as some leaks indicate pretty damning evidence that seals, penguins and otters could be arriving in the next upcoming DLC. It's not a full-fledged aquarium pack with fish, sharks and cetaceans, but it's enough to quench the demands of the player base. Modding support has been consistently Frontier Development's weak point, as the studio are completely apathetic towards the modding community and have never provided any meaningful modding tools for their games. The only mod-related feature in Planet Zoo is the Steam Workshop integration, where players can share their blueprints to the public. Despite this, there are still modding efforts, but these have been limited to model reworks or replacements. I consider modding very important for the zoo game genre, as the developers will never be able to provide the wide-scale, biodiverse roster the player base desires. The reason why the Zoo Tycoon series lasted so long after development ceased was because the modding community, one of the largest and most productive modding communities of the 2000s decade, consistently released new animal species to extend the longevity of the game. That is not the case with Planet Zoo, and probably won't be the case into the future, judging by the lack of modding support with their previous Jurassic World Evolution and Planet Coaster. The already stunning Planet Coaster engine has been slightly upgraded for Planet Zoo, maintaining all the praiseworthy effects, the bubbly user interface, and light-hearted tone from its predecessor. A likewise addictive soundtrack is also provided, but the performance issues inherited continue to plague the series. 7 out of 10. It's definitively the most realistic recreation of animals in any zoo game thus far, and I'm willing to give it a perfect score because frankly I've never seen anything better from this subgenre. Biology critics will have some minor nitpickings, but for the majority of the fanbase, the animals deliver. 10 out of 10. Gameplay was seemingly sacrificed for the creative elements of the game, and it shows. Most players will inevitably spend most of their hours interacting with the building mechanics in pause mode rather than actually playing the game. Unfortunately, Planet Zoo only delivers a modicum of its advertised meaningful management, making the gameplay experience nothing greater than mediocre. 5 out of 10. On the other hand, the creative aspects of the game must be praised, enabling players to literally build the zoo of their dreams in any way, shape or form, as long as they put in the artistic effort. For more casual players, the existence of blueprints inside the game and on the Steam Workshop cater to a traditional plop and play design style. Some inherent issues such as paving prevent a perfect score. 9 out of 10. A pretty lengthy career mode with several interesting scenarios that not only act as a tutorial for the game, but takes players out of their comfort zones and features some inspirational zoo designs. Not an amazing narrative by any stretch, but there's enough entertainment value here and achievement hunting replayability to warrant a playthrough. 8 out of 10. Frontier's post-release has been disappointing, it must be said, with underwhelming updates and DLCs having done little to prevent eventual stagnation and staleness. The lack of modding support further compounds the issue. The game desperately needs something big and exciting to really reinvigorate the fanbase, and the developers need to show some ambition to deliver it. 3 out of 10. My final rating for Planet Zoo is a 7 out of 10. Planet Zoo currently runs for a retail price of $44.99 unchanged since release. This is a pretty fair, even cheap price for a game that can easily provide a few hundred hours worth of fun. As we've explained in this video, however, the appeal will not be universal and mileage will drastically vary for different players, but for this price point I think it's worth a solid purchase. Planet Zoo has also gone on sale multiple times over the past year, despite it being only a year old, so even better value if players wish to wait for one of those. For $10 extra, players can buy the Planet Zoo Deluxe Edition, which comes with 3 animals, the Pygmy Hippopotamus, Thompson's Gazelle and Komodo Dragon, as well as the soundtrack and some wallpapers. This is certainly not worth the price if you're calculating from a species per dollar perspective, so skip unless you want the full complete animal roster. The animals on offer are also pretty lackluster, all things considered. 3 out of 10, a pretty disappointing and expensive deluxe edition, especially when compared to the base game price. The Arctic Pack adds 4 animals, 2 career scenarios and 200 scenery items. Only the polar bear and reindeer are noteworthy and lucrative species. The 2 scenarios are fun, but only worth one sitting, whilst players will struggle to get the most out of all the scenery items because most of them are themed around snow. For $10, again, it's a steep price, certainly an improvement over the deluxe edition, but get it on sale or not at all. 4 out of 10. This was an extremely hyped pack because there were so many possible animal choices arriving from this continent. The jaguar and giant anteater were welcome, the others a lot less desirable. It also surprisingly doesn't come with any scenarios. The 250 scenery items do add some jungle diversity, especially the construction pieces themed around the Incan temples, which will see some use. Overall, however, the animals matter a lot, and for the price, it's just not worth it. 5 out of 10. Another immensely hyped pack, but the stubbornness to follow a 5 animal per pack formula results in not enough coverage for such a biodiverse continent, but enough to cover most of the bases. 230 scenery items and a time scenario are also included. Probably the most value pack out of the 3, and perhaps the only pack that could make an argument for paying full price. Regardless, get it on sale. 7 out of 10. The golden age of zoo games may be over, but Planet Zoo champions itself as the banner carrier of the modern zoo genre, combining realistic and detailed animal designs with a limitless, free-form building system. It's not quite a mechanically deep management sim, however, and should be seen more as a blank canvas for players to express their artistic fantasies into the form of a zoo builder. Planet Zoo is nevertheless a strong addition to a market that's been crying out for a revival of the nostalgia that's been missing since the Zoo Tycoon series. Hopefully, with future improvements, more content expansions, and less stubbornness from the developers, Planet Zoo can cement its place as the quintessential zoo game of the modern era. This was Planet Zoo, a year in review. Thanks to our Patreon supporters for making this video possible. If you'd like to find more in-depth reviews and more Planet Zoo content, please consider supporting the channel.